Колеги, ми продовжуємо робочий день і зараз на скайп-зв'язку у нас буде заступник керівника спеціальної моніторингової місії ОБСЄ пан Олександр Хуг із оперативною інформацією щодо безпеки в Україні. Mr. Alexander, can you hear us well?
Yes, I hear you.
We are ready to listen to your report, please.
Thank you very much. Greetings from Donetsk city, ladies and gentlemen. I'm back here in Donetsk to assess the situation, speak to key interlocutors and to consult with my monitors. We also wish to work on opening additional forward patrol bases, assess damaged infrastructure and receive updates on the planned withdrawal of tanks, artillery, mortars as per the addendum. Let me brief you on the latest development regarding security and humanitarian situation as observed by the monitors of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine. The situation remained calm in most of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. However, the risk of escalation remained high. While most explosions and small arms fire were attributed to demining and training activities, we also registered those that could not be attributed to these kinds of activities. On 20th of October, for example, at the railway station in Donetsk, the SMM heard a total of 28 explosions and 2 single small arm shots in an alleged exchange of fire in the area of the Volvo Center. This led to a fatality and several injured. A second incident that demonstrates the high tension levels in what is supposed to be a security zone is the following. On 20th of October, at a so-called LPR control checkpoint near Holobivske, the SMM followed up on a report that a Ukraine armed force member had been killed in that area on 19th of October. The SMM observed damage to the checkpoint and assessed it was caused by small arms fire. The SMM observed at the checkpoint the body of a Ukrainian soldier. The SMM facilitated the transfer of the deceased to a government-controlled area. Incidents like these that I have just outlined show how fragile the ceasefire is and how easily the situation can escalate. The SMM did not, however, record any systematic, intensive fire. Since 20th of October, the SMM monitored the start of the second stage of withdrawal stipulated in the addendum to the package of measures. Stage 2 concerns Donetsk region and part of the Luhansk region. Earlier, in the Luhansk region, the SMM completed monitoring of the withdrawal of weaponry under the addendum. Visits to storage sites were conducted and will continue. We hope the withdrawal will significantly contribute to strengthening the ceasefire and pave the way for a durable peace. In order to facilitate our monitoring, we are ready to open new forward patrol bases. We have now 2 opened in Ukraine, on the Ukrainian side, and in the area, 1 controlled by the so-called LPR. We are awaiting access to several proposed sites in areas controlled by the so-called DPR. These additional bases will greatly enhance the SMM's ability to monitor the situation along and near the contact line. In the meantime, the SMM continued to revisit heavy weapons holding areas on both sides of the contact line. The situation remained largely similar to previous weeks, with weapons missing from both Ukrainian armed forces and so-called DPR sites. We have yet to be granted access to a designated so-called LPR heavy weapon holding area. The absence of declared so-called LPR heavy weapon holding areas prevents the verification of withdrawal of these types of weapons. The armed forces of Ukraine and the so-called DPR have declared such holding areas. The SMM continue to observe weapons and military movements in the east, though to a lesser extent. In the area of so-called DPR-controlled Sanseve, in violation of respective withdrawal lines, an SMM unmanned aerial vehicle observed 8 main battle tanks on 30.
У Первомайському, яке контролюється урядом України, СММ спостерігало 12 жовтня 12 бойових танків. Я хочу ще раз повторити.
Presence and the very presence of weapons in the security zone, whether for training or other purposes, creates insecurity between the sides and, of course, is a threat to life. Meanwhile, as the ceasefire largely holds, civilians return to their homes in towns and villages along the contact line. They are likely to encounter difficult living conditions there, as well as the threat of mines and unexploded ordnance. Just a few examples from last week. 2 women were reportedly killed on 13th of October after they accidentally triggered a mine near the bridge in Stanica Lukhanska, and a child was injured by an unexploded ordnance in Hranitne at the family home. The issue of mines and unexploded ordnance is high on the list of estimates concerns. In the absence of a coordinated approach to demining, some civilians started to destroying unexploded ordnances themselves, like, for example, in so-called DPR-controlled Toykaichevsk and in so-called DPR-controlled Larinye. Just this week, the Chief Monitor, Ambassador Appakan, and I returned from the 14th meeting within the Trilateral Contact Group in Minsk. As the chair of the Security Working Group, the SMM continued to facilitate discussions about mines with the participants. Progress in this regard can contribute to normalization of the situation on the ground. It should take little convincing the Minsk signatories to agree to the mapping, marking, and fencing of areas contaminated by unexploded ordnance. Another item on the agenda of the Security Working Group is the plan for disengagement in Shirokine. We still see evidence of the presence of armed groups in the vicinity of the village, which exposes displaced persons from the village who seek to collect their belongings and visit their homes, to the double risk of crossfires and that of unexploded ordnance. Dear friends, the humanitarian situation in eastern Ukraine remains complex. In some towns and villages there is a lack of food, gas and electricity, and there is an urgent need to repair houses and basic infrastructure, especially with the winter approaching. Tens of thousands of people living in areas controlled by the so-called DPR have no access to life-saving medicine. In so-called DPR-controlled Nikishine, the SMM noted that public and civilian houses throughout the village had been damaged or completely destroyed. A representative of the village, so-called administration, told the SMM monitors that out of a total of 353 houses in the village, over 150 had been entirely destroyed and other 90 remain heavily damaged. Some communities need not wait for winter in order to be experiencing a dire situation. In government-controlled Operativna, for example, 70 people have been living in basements without electricity, water or gas since January 2015. The population of government-controlled Piski reduced to only 16 from almost 5,000 before the conflict, and they live in dismissal conditions. In so-called LPR-controlled Pris-Hip, residents have no gas supply due to damage to pipeline inflicted during the fighting. In government-controlled areas, the humanitarian situation is complicated by the inability of many international humanitarian organizations to operate due to difficulties with obtaining so-called accreditation. Also, in Donetsk region, hospitals lack medicines on both sides of the contact line. In so-called DPR-controlled Khorlivka, for example, the hospital number 2 is reporting shortage of medicine and supplies, namely in anesthetics, antibiotics, and fuel for ambulances. With people returning to the city, the situation will only worsen. In government-controlled Mironivsky, hospitals are understaffed. A very worrisome finding is that children are not getting vaccinated against preventable childhood diseases, and this raises the risks of an outbreak. At this point, allow me to make one thing clear. All sides, under international humanitarian law, need to allow safe and unimpeded access to humanitarian aid. They need to allow aid workers to go about their jobs and not restrict their freedom of movement through bureaucratic hurdles or other obstructions. The most vulnerable, especially children, require access to medicines, vaccinations against childhood diseases, mind risk education, and to psychological support. Humanitarian concerns of Ukrainians on both sides of the line of contact should supersede any political or military agenda. The freedom of movement of civilians across the contact line remains challenging. Me and my monitors still observe long queues, long waiting hours, and the lack of facilities at checkpoints. For instance, on 20th of October, in the area of so-called DPR-controlled Khorlivka, the SMM observed more than 3,000 civilian vehicles waiting to proceed from so-called DPR-controlled areas towards government-controlled areas through the government checkpoint in Mayorsk. The queue extended through the area between the Mayorsk checkpoint and the so-called DPR-controlled checkpoint at the outskirts of Khorlivka. More than 300 people were waiting for public buses at the Mayorsk checkpoint. Irritated drivers told the SMM that they had been waiting for more than 24 hours. The SMM's freedom of movement also continues to be restricted by all actors. During the week, the Ukraine-Russian border in so-called LPR-controlled areas remained inaccessible, with the so-called LPR denying us access on 4 separate occasions in clear contravention of the provision of the Minsk documents and the SMM mandate. In addition, the SMM unmanned aerial vehicles were jammed while flying over so-called DPR-controlled Saichenko on 17th and 18th of October. Finally, as usual, an update on the numbers of the mission members. As of this week, the SMM has 591 monitors, 75 other international staff, and 271 Ukrainian staff. Thank you for your attention, and I'm available for any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Hug. Dear journalists, are there any questions or clarifications? There are no questions. So thank you, Mr. Hug, and looking forward to seeing you next week. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.